The sun was setting on the horizon of Los Angeles when Edward Morgan finished loading the last bag of cement for the construction of the new wing of the orphanage. His clothes, once impeccably white, were now stained with grease and dust. But his smile remained intact. At 45, the billionaire had made philanthropy more than a cause. It was his life's purpose. "Mr. Morgan, you really didn't need to do all this heavy work," said Mary, the orphanage coordinator, offering him a towel. Edward wiped his sweaty face with the towel and smiled. "Mary, how long have you known me?" 5 years. "You know I can't just stand still and watch. I need to get my hands dirty, literally." His cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Richard, his personal assistant, reminding him of the flight that would depart in 2 hours for Seattle, where he would inaugurate his newest social project, a professional training center for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. "Won't you have time to go home and change?" asked Mary, concerned about his appearance. "No way. I'll go like this." "You know I don't care about these formalities," replied Edward, picking up his worn backpack, the only personal item he carried besides his cell phone. On the way to the airport, Edward observed the busy streets of Los Angeles through the car window. Each luxurious building contrasted with small communities around it, a constant reminder of why he had chosen this path. His fortune, built in the technology sector, could easily have isolated him in a bubble of privilege, but Edward chose a different path. "Richard, did you confirm my reservation on the flight?" he asked, adjusting himself in the back seat. "Yes, sir. First class as always, although I think you should consider using your private jet for these trips," replied Richard, who from the beginning had been trying to convince Edward to adopt a lifestyle more befitting his position. "You know I prefer to travel like anyone else. I only use that jet for emergencies or when I need to transport equipment for projects," Edward replied, firm in his convictions. Upon arriving at the airport, Edward said goodbye to the driver and walked side by side with Richard towards check-in. Some curious and even derogatory looks followed him, but he was used to it. His simple appearance and work-stained clothes completely contrasted with the first-class environment. In the check-in line, an elegant lady discreetly moved away as she saw him approach. Edward just smiled, accustomed to these reactions. The check-in attendant looked twice at his passport before confirming his identity, clearly surprised by the contrast between the official photo and his current appearance. "Mr. Morgan, your flight is confirmed. Gate 15, boarding in 40 minutes, she said, still hesitant. As they walked to the boarding area, Richard commented in a low voice, "You could have at least changed your shirt." Edward laughed. "Richard, if I cared what others thought, I would never have gotten where I am. Besides, these sweat and grease stains are medals of honor. They mean I spent the day doing something that really matters." In the VIP lounge, Edward preferred to sit in a more discreet corner, taking the opportunity to answer some emails on his cell phone. Around him, executives in expensive suits and women with glittering jewelry talked about business and international travel. The contrast was evident, but Edward remained absorbed in his own world, reviewing the details of the project in Seattle. "Edward," called Richard, "I think we should start heading to the boarding gate." Getting up, Edward adjusted his worn backpack on his shoulder and walked towards the exit of the VIP lounge. On the way, he heard whispered comments. "How do they let anyone in here? Standards have really fallen," but his smile didn't waver. Each disdainful comment only reinforced his certainty that he was on the right path. The aircraft corridor seemed narrower as Edward advanced towards his seat in first class. The flight attendant, Patricia Sanders, frowned as she saw him approach, discreetly holding her communication radio. "Excuse me, sir, this is the first-class section," she said, strategically positioning herself in his way. Edward, with his usual serenity, extended his boarding pass. "Yes, seat 3A. Patricia examined the document with evident suspicion, her eyes alternating between the paper and Edward's dirty clothes. Reluctantly, she stepped aside, allowing his passage but not without exchanging significant looks with another flight attendant. "Richard, you can go to your seat. I'll be fine here," said Edward to his assistant, who hesitated before heading to business class. An elegant executive in the seat next to him immediately called the flight attendant. Is there any possibility of changing seats? I have an important meeting tomorrow and need to rest properly, she said, casting deprecating looks at Edward. I'll check the possibilities, ma'am, Patricia replied solicitously. Edward remained silent, organizing his documents about the Seattle project. Around him, the whispers increased. A gentleman in an Italian suit 2 rows ahead turned to observe him with disdain, commenting something with his wife that resulted in contained laughter. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass again?" asked another flight attendant, approaching with an authoritative air. "Of course," replied Edward, handing over the document for the second time. The flight attendant examined the card thoroughly, even holding it up to the light as if looking for signs of forgery. "Wait a moment, please." In the cockpit, Captain Charles Anderson received the report about an inadequate passenger in seat 3A. Known for his rigidity and perfectionism, Charles had built his reputation by maintaining high standards on his flights. "How did this get past check-in?" he questioned, irritated. "I'll check personally." Meanwhile, Edward was trying to ask for a glass of water, but was systematically ignored by the crew. The passenger next to him had managed her transfer, and now the empty seat beside him seemed to create an exclusion zone around him. "Excuse me, sir," Charles's deep voice echoed. "We need to verify your documentation." Edward, keeping calm, began to search for his ID. "Can I help you with something specific, Captain?" "How did you gain access to this flight?" asked Charles, his voice loaded with suspicion. "This is an aircraft with rigorous safety standards." "Through normal means. I bought my ticket and checked in regularly," replied Edward, extending his documents. The captain barely looked at the papers. "Sir, this is an executive flight. We have certain standards to maintain." A small crowd was beginning to form. Some passengers were discreetly filming the scene with their cell phones, while others nodded in approval of the captain's stance. "I'm aware of the standards, Captain, and I assure you that my ticket was duly issued." Edward kept his voice calm, although the tension in the environment was palpable. "It's not just about the ticket," Charles raised his voice. "Your behavior and appearance are causing discomfort." To other passengers, a young flight attendant, Megan Wilson, observed the scene with growing discomfort. "Captain, maybe we should—" "Stay out of this," Charles cut her off. Turning back to Edward, he continued, "I'm going to ask you to leave, voluntarily, or will be forced to take more severe measures." Edward remained seated, his serene expression contrasting with the hostility around him. "I'm sorry, Captain, but there's no legal reason for my removal. I have all my documents in order." The calm response seemed to enrage the captain even more. His eyes flashed with anger, his hands closed into fists. The tension reached its peak, and what happened next would leave deep marks on everyone present. The sound of the impact echoed through the cabin when Captain Charles's fist hit Edward's face. The silence that followed was deafening. Drops of blood stained the already dirty shirt of the billionaire, while expressions of shock took over the faces around. Megan, the young flight attendant, ran towards Edward. "Sir, are you all right? Do I need to call an ambulance?" "Get away from him," ordered Charles, still consumed by fury. "This imposter needs to learn a lesson about respect." It was at this moment that Richard burst through the curtain separating the classes, his normally serene face transformed by indignation. "Enough! Do you have any idea who you just assaulted?" The assistant pulled out his tablet, quickly accessing the CNN News website. On the screen, a recent photo showed Edward Morgan receiving an International Philanthropy Award, the same man who was now cleaning the blood from his face with a handkerchief offered by Megan. "This is Edward Morgan, founder of TechMind and one of the country's greatest philanthropists," announced Richard, his voice trembling with contained anger. "The man you judge by appearance just donated $50 million to build a professional training center in Seattle." Shock ran through the cabin like a wave. The executive who had asked to change seats let out a small scream. The couple that was laughing moments before sank into their seats. Patricia, the flight attendant who first questioned him, visibly paled. "Impossible," muttered Charles, his face alternating between red with anger and white with fear. "Why would someone like him be dressed like this?" completed Edward, finally speaking up. His voice remained calm, but carried a weight that silenced everyone. Because I spent the day helping to build a new wing in an orphanage. Because I believe that a person's value is not in the clothes they wear or the position they hold. Megan, still by his side, offered ice for the injury. Edward thanked her with a gentle smile, the same one he maintained when working with underprivileged children or talking to homeless people. "I want this plane back on the ground immediately," ordered Edward, his natural authority finally manifesting. "And Megan, please note down your contact. Your attitude today demonstrated something rare, humanity in the midst of prejudice." The passengers who were filming the scene now lowered their cell phones, embarrassed. Richard was already on the phone with the airline's board of directors, his controlled but firm voice echoing words like lawsuit and compensation. "Mr. Morgan," began Charles, his previous arrogance replaced by palpable fear. "I didn't know. I thought—" "Exactly, Captain," interrupted Edward, standing up. "You didn't know, none of you knew, and even if I wasn't who I am, this violence would be equally unacceptable." The plane began its return to the runway, a heavy silence dominating the cabin. Some passengers were crying silently, others were frantically typing on their cell phones, probably sharing the incident on social media. "Richard," called Edward, "contact our communication team. I don't want this to be treated as just another passing scandal. Let's turn this incident into something bigger." His assistant nodded, immediately understanding. Edward Morgan was known, not only for his fortune or philanthropy, but for his ability to transform adverse situations into opportunities for social change. "Megan," he continued, turning to the flight attendant, "I'd like you to participate in what I'm planning. Your attitude today proved that there's still hope for a less prejudiced society." As the plane taxied back to the terminal, Edward observed the runway lights through the window. In his mind, he was already formulating the outlines of a campaign that would transform that moment of discrimination into a catalyst for profound changes in American society. The morning after the incident, the hashtag #ChasBeyondAppearances was already dominating social media. The videos recorded by passengers spread like wildfire, generating a wave of national indignation. Edward observed all of this from his office at TechMind, while his communication team worked frantically to turn that moment into something constructive. "The views have already passed 10 million, sir," informed Julia, his communications director. "All major networks are asking for exclusive interviews." Edward adjusted the bandage on his face and smiled. "Let's do it differently, Julia. I don't want to appear as a victim in traditional media. I want to use this moment to start a deeper conversation about prejudice in our society." Megan, the flight attendant who had defended him, arrived for the meeting that Edward had scheduled. Her eyes still carried the weight of the previous night, but there was determination in her posture. "Megan, thank you for coming," Edward welcomed her warmly. "You represent exactly what I want to show America, that we can always choose the path of empathy." "Mr. Morgan, I just did what any person should do," she replied humbly. "But they didn't, did they?" Edward stood up, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of Los Angeles. "And that's why I need your help. I want to launch the Beyond Appearances campaign, and I'd like you to be one of the spokespersons." In the meeting room, Richard presented the first drafts of the campaign. The idea was to create a series of documentary videos showing people who faced similar prejudices, but also highlighting those who, like Megan, chose to see beyond appearances. "We already have 5 important companies wanting to participate," informed Richard. "They have committed to implementing awareness programs and more inclusive policies." Meanwhile, on social media, a spontaneous movement was beginning to gain strength. People were sharing their own stories of prejudice using the hashtag, creating a chain of solidarity that transcended social classes. A college student from Chicago posted, "After seeing what happened to Mr. Morgan, I decided to create a social project in my neighborhood. If a billionaire can get his hands dirty to help others, why can't I?" Edward received an important call during the meeting. It was the president of the airline begging for a chance to repair the damages. "We want to be part of the solution," he said, visibly nervous. "Great," replied Edward, "because I have some suggestions for structural changes in how you train your team." In the afternoon, Edward recorded a simple video on his cell phone, without edits or elaborate productions. In it, he appeared still in the dirty clothes from the volunteer work of the day. "I'm not here to point fingers or seek revenge," he began. "I'm here to invite every American to reflect. How many times have we judged someone by appearance? How many opportunities have we lost to meet extraordinary people because of our prejudices?" The video continued with Edward showing images of his volunteer work, the people he helped, the smiles he collected. True wealth is not in what we wear or possess, but in the ability to see value in every human being. Megan, watching the recording, couldn't hold back her tears. "How do you manage to maintain serenity after everything that happened?" "Because I know that anger only generates more anger," replied Edward. "What we need is understanding, education, and most importantly, example." At the end of that afternoon, Edward received an unexpected message. It was from Captain Charles's daughter, asking for an opportunity to talk. The billionaire didn't hesitate to accept, seeing there another chance to transform a negative moment into learning. The Beyond Appearances campaign was beginning to take shape, promising to be much more than a response to an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a movement for real change in American society, led by a man who proved, with his actions, that true greatness is far beyond appearances. Bethany Anderson, 23 years old, watched for the 10th time the video that showed her father, Captain Charles, assaulting Edward Morgan. Each viewing hurt more than the previous one. In her room at the student housing in Los Angeles, where she was in her last year of law school, she tried to reconcile the image of the loving father she knew with the violent man in the viral video. "Dad, how could you?" she muttered to herself, while reading the outraged comments on social media. Her cell phone rang. It was her mother, Helen. "Beth, your father is devastated," said Helen, her voice choked. "He hasn't left his room since he was suspended. You need to come home." "Mom, I don't know if I can look at him right now," replied Bethany, running her hands through her hair in frustration. "Did you see what he did? Him, who always taught me about respect and dignity." At the Anderson house, the atmosphere was heavy. Charles remained isolated in his office, the curtains closed, avoiding the insistent calls from journalists. Helen tried to maintain a normal routine, but the weight of the situation was visible in her tired eyes. Bethany finally decided to go home for the weekend. On the way, she received a notification. Edward Morgan had responded to her message, agreeing to meet her. "Miss Anderson," he wrote, "I would be honored to talk to you. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most difficult moments." When she arrived home, Bethany found her father unrecognizable. The always proud and meticulous captain now seemed smaller, hunched in his favorite armchair, with an unshaven beard and deep dark circles under his eyes. "Dad," she called from the office door. Charles raised his eyes, and Bethany saw something she never imagined seeing. Tears. "Daughter, forgive me." "It's not me you need to ask for forgiveness," she replied, sitting in front of him. "Why, Dad? Why did you do that?" "I don't know, Beth." He ran his hands over his tired face. "It was as if something inside me exploded. All the pressure of maintaining standards, of always being perfect. But that's no excuse. I failed. I failed as a professional, as a human being, and especially as an example for you." Bethany took a deep breath. "Tomorrow I'm going to meet Mr. Morgan." Charles straightened up in the armchair, alarmed. "What? He agreed to receive you?" "Yes, Dad, and I want you to write a letter to him, not out of obligation or fear of legal action, but because you need to do this for yourself." Throughout the night, Charles worked on the letter. Each word was heavy, each sentence laden with sincere regret. When he finished, dawn was breaking. The next day, Beatrice met Edward in his office at TechBrain. She expected to find an intimidating man, but saw only simplicity and kindness in his eyes. "Mr. Matthews," she began, her hands trembling as she handed over the letter. "First of all, I want to say I'm sorry. As a daughter, as a citizen, as a human being." Edward read the letter in silence, his expression softening with each paragraph. "Your initiative to come here says a lot about you, Beatrice, and this letter, I can feel the sincerity in your father's words. He's devastated, she confessed. Not that he doesn't deserve the consequences, but he's your father, Edward completed. You know, Beatrice, sometimes we need to fall to learn how to get up differently. I have a proposal for you and your father. Edward's proposal was surprising. He wanted Charles to participate in the Beyond Appearances campaign, not as a villain, but as an example of transformation. Your story can help other people recognize and overcome their own prejudices, he explained. Beatrice left the meeting with mixed emotions. As she walked back home, she realized that some stories need moments of darkness for light to shine more brightly. Her father had a chance at redemption, and she would be by his side on this journey of transformation. The auditorium at TechBrain was packed for the official launch of the Beyond Appearances campaign. Charles nervously adjusted his tie backstage, while his daughter Beatrice held his hand in support. He no longer wore his commander's uniform. He wore a simple suit, purposely chosen to represent his new beginning. "Are you ready, Dad?" Beatrice asked, observing the crowd through the curtain gap. "No," he answered honestly, "but I need to do this." Edward Matthews took the stage first, still with a slight bruise visible on his face. His presence caused a respectful silence in the audience, composed of journalists, business people, and social activists. 2 weeks ago, an incident on a plane generated headlines across the country, Edward began. But today we're not here to talk about violence or revenge. We're here to talk about transformation. In the front row, Mary, the flight attendant, watched attentively. Next to her, other airline employees showed visible discomfort. "I want to introduce you to someone who had the courage to face his own demons," Edward continued. "Someone who chose to turn a mistake into a lesson for all of us." Charles took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The camera flashes blinded him, but he maintained focus. His hands trembled as he held the microphone. "My name is Charles Williamson," his voice faltered slightly. "And 2 weeks ago, I was the personification of the prejudice that contaminates our society." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Some people were filming with their cell phones, others taking notes frantically. "For 25 years as a commander, I prided myself on maintaining the highest standards," he continued. "But I realized that I had confused professional standards with personal prejudices. I judged a man by his appearance and committed an unforgivable act." In the audience, Helen, his wife, cried silently. Beatrice squeezed her hand, proud of her father's courage. "Mr. Matthews could have sued me, could have completely destroyed my career." Charles looked directly at Edward. "Instead, he offered me something much more valuable, the chance to become a better person." Edward stood up and walked to Charles, extending his hand. The handshake between the two men was captured by dozens of cameras, symbolizing the power of reconciliation. "From today on," Charles announced, "I will dedicate my life to combating prejudice in aviation and beyond. Together with TechBrain and the airline, we've developed a mandatory training program on unconscious biases for all employees in the sector." Mary was called to the stage to share her perspective. "That day I just followed my heart," she said, "but I learned that sometimes following your heart means going against the system." The program presented included significant changes in service protocols, awareness workshops, and the creation of a reporting channel for discrimination cases. "This is just the beginning," Edward concluded. "The Beyond Appearances campaign isn't about one person or an isolated incident. It's about transforming our society one person at a time." After the event backstage, Charles approached Edward again. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank me," Edward replied. "Prove that change is possible through your actions." Beatrice watched the scene with tears in her eyes, realizing that she was witnessing not just her father's redemption, but the birth of a movement that could really make a difference in American society. The impact of the Beyond Appearances campaign spread rapidly across the United States. A month after its launch, stories of transformation began to emerge from different corners of the country. In the outskirts of Atlanta, Joanna Sanders, a high-end street vendor, was hired by a large department store after the manager watched the campaign videos. "Before, no one gave me a chance because of my tattoos," Joanna recounted in an emotional testimonial for the campaign channel. "Now I'm the employee of the month." In New York, TechBrain transformed into a center for social innovation. Edward converted the 10th floor of the building into a space dedicated to the campaign, where companies sent their employees for awareness training. "The results are impressive," Richard commented during an evaluation meeting. "Over 200 companies have already implemented our diversity and inclusion program." Mary, now the program coordinator at the airline, led transformative workshops. Her story inspired other employees to rethink their own prejudices. "A flight attendant told me she always judged passengers by their appearance," she reported. After the training, she realized how many valuable human connections she was missing. Charles also found his purpose. His lectures on personal transformation filled auditoriums. He didn't hide his shame from the past, using it as a tool for awareness. "If I, after 25 years reinforcing prejudices, could change, anyone can," he said in his speeches. The movement surpassed corporate boundaries. Public schools began adopting educational material developed by the campaign. In Boston, a teacher created the Look Beyond project with her high school students. "Children are naturally free from prejudices," she explained in a video conference with Edward. "We need to nurture this purity of vision." International media began reporting on the phenomenon. The New York Times published an extensive article on how an incident of discrimination in the US was generating a social revolution. Edward maintained his volunteer work routine, now accompanied by executives who wanted to learn from his example. On a Saturday, the CEO of a major bank sweated beside him building affordable housing. "I never imagined manual labor could be so rewarding," admitted the executive, his expensive clothes stained with paint. Beatrice organized a group of law students to offer free legal assistance to victims of discrimination. The project, supported by TechBrain, had already helped hundreds of people. "My father taught me that true transformation requires concrete action," she explained in an interview. At the airline, changes were visible. New uniforms were developed to accommodate different cultural expressions. The code of conduct was rewritten, emphasizing respect for diversity. One day, Edward received an unexpected email. It was from a gentleman who had been on the flight during the incident. "I watched you being assaulted and did nothing," he wrote. "Yesterday, I defended a young man who was being discriminated against on the subway. Your campaign taught me that neutrality in the face of prejudice is complicity." Social media overflowed with similar accounts. The hashtag #CharlesBeyondAppearances became a symbol of social change. People shared moments when they chose to see beyond stereotypes. "Real change," Edward reflected during a meeting with his team, "happens when each person decides to be an agent of transformation in their own circle of influence." In Central Park, New York, Peter watched the movement while shining shoes. At 65, he was used to people averting their gaze or holding their bags tighter when passing by him. But something was changing. An executive stopped at his chair that morning. "Mr. Peter, I came especially to find you. I read your story on the Beyond Appearances campaign website and want to get to know you better." Peter smiled, recognizing Sarah, who now came regularly. Not just to have her shoes shined, but to talk about life, dreams, and experiences. She had discovered that the man of simple appearance was a literature graduate and knew more about poetry than many university professors. On the other side of the city, the Flavor and Art restaurant was implementing changes inspired by the campaign. Marianne, the owner, hired George, a talented chef who had been living on the streets, after meeting him in a social project. "People judged his food without even tasting it, just because of his condition," explained Marianne. "Today we have waiting lines every day, and our customers love it when George comes out of the kitchen to chat." At Lincoln High School, Principal Regina implemented a special project. Students were encouraged to share stories of prejudice and overcoming. Laura, a 16-year-old student, revealed how the campaign changed her perspective. "I used to mock a classmate for wearing simple clothes," she confessed during a conversation circle. "Then I discovered she helped support her family by selling sweets. Today we're best friends, and I make a point of buying her brownies." In a traditional bank downtown, Manager Robert surprised his employees by appearing dressed simply, reproducing Edward Matthews' example. "I spent an entire day being ignored in my own branch," he reported in the following meeting. It was a powerful lesson on how we treat people based solely on appearance. Charles, the former commander, now dedicated his afternoons to a special project. He gave physics and math classes to underprivileged youth who dreamed of becoming pilots. "When I look into these boys' and girls' eyes," he said during a meeting with Edward, "I see the future I almost denied because of my prejudice." Mary continued her mission at the airline, but now went beyond formal training. She created a support group for employees to share experiences and discuss ways to combat prejudice in daily life. Yesterday, a passenger tried to prevent an elderly gentleman from sitting in first class, a flight attendant recounted during a meeting. "I showed her the video of our campaign, and by the end of the flight she was apologizing." Beatrice, inspired by her father's work, expanded her legal assistance project. Now, in addition to serving victims of discrimination, she offered human rights workshops in companies and schools. "Prejudice has deep roots," she explained in her lectures. "But each small gesture of respect and understanding helps to uproot them." In a shopping mall in Los Angeles, Mrs. Franklin, a cleaning lady for 20 years, noticed a significant change in the treatment she received. "Before it was as if I were invisible," she recounted in an emotional testimonial. "Now people call me by my name, stop to chat. A customer even invited me to her daughter's birthday party." Edward observed all these stories with satisfaction. The campaign was achieving something rare, transforming abstract concepts into concrete changes in people's daily lives. Each smile exchanged, each prejudice overcome, each barrier torn down, he reflected in his diary, is a small victory in building a fairer world. The Grand Hall of the UN in Geneva was packed as Edward Matthews took the stage to receive the International Human Rights Award. By his side, Charles, Mary, and Beatrice represented the thousands of people who had become part of the social transformation initiated in the United States. "Prejudice knows no borders," Edward began his speech, "but neither does the capacity for change." In the audience, delegations from various countries listened attentively. The Beyond Appearances campaign had become a global case study in social transformation. "We began with a moment of conflict on an airplane," he continued. "Today, our message reaches schools in Africa, companies in Europe, and communities in Asia." A documentary about the campaign was being shown at international festivals. The images ranged from the original incident to the profound changes that followed. Children from different social backgrounds studying together, executives working on social projects, people breaking down barriers of prejudice across America. Charles was invited to the stage to share his experience. His story of transformation had become a symbol of hope. "My greatest achievement wasn't keeping my job or regaining my reputation," he declared. "It was learning that it's never too late to change." Mary presented the results of the program implemented in American aviation. The numbers were impressive: a 90% reduction in discrimination complaints, a significant increase in passenger satisfaction, and a revolution in the sector's corporate culture. "We didn't just transform procedures," she explained. "We transformed hearts." Beatrice shared how the Legal Assistance Project had expanded to other countries in North America. Volunteer lawyers now offered legal support to victims of discrimination across the region. Harvard University had included the campaign in its social studies curriculum. Researchers documented how an initiative born from conflict was redefining patterns of social behavior. "The United States has taught us a valuable lesson," commented a Yale professor during the event. "Effective social change begins with personal transformation." Global companies began adopting the model developed by TechBrain. The awareness program created by Edward and his team was being translated into 28 languages. On the big screen, images showed initiatives inspired by the campaign. A mentoring program in India, breaking caste barriers, a Japanese company revolutionizing its hiring policies, a school in South Africa promoting social integration. Each story of transformation, Edward emphasized, is a victory against the prejudice that limits human potential. The UN award was not just recognition, but a call to expand the movement even further. Representatives from 50 countries signed a commitment to implement programs based on the American campaign. At the end of the ceremony, Edward, Charles, Mary, and Beatrice gathered for a historic photo. Their expressions reflected not just pride, but the certainty that they were witnessing something greater than themselves. "This is just the beginning," said Edward, observing the multicultural audience. "The real prize will be when we no longer need campaigns like this." The event in Geneva marked not only the international recognition of the campaign, but the beginning of a new phase. The movement, that began with a conflict on an airplane, was now taking off to transform lives across the planet. 5 years after the airplane incident, Edward Matthews walked through the corridors of the new Center for Inclusion and Diversity in New York. The building, constructed with resources from TechBrain, was a living symbol of the legacy of the Beyond Appearances campaign. In the main lobby, a permanent exhibition told the story of the movement through photos and testimonials. The image of the confrontation on the plane, now historic, contrasted with thousands of records of positive transformations that followed. "Mr. Matthews," called a familiar voice. It was John, the center's janitor, a former homeless man who had been one of the first people impacted by the campaign. "The students from the public school have arrived for the guided tour." Edward smiled as he saw the group of children entering the building, their expressions marveling at the welcoming environment. Among the guides, he recognized Charles, who now dedicated his retirement to educating young people about respect and dignity. "Who can tell me what it means to judge someone by their appearance?" Charles asked the children, his gentle voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned from his own mistakes. On the upper floor, Mary was conducting a training session for international executives. The airline had become a global reference in inclusive policies, and she traveled the world sharing her experience. "The true luxury of a company isn't in its facilities," she said, "but in how it treats each human being." Beatrice, now a renowned lawyer specializing in human rights, coordinated the global network of legal assistance that was born from the initial project. Her office downtown operated 24 hours, offering support to people in vulnerable situations. The campaign had evolved into a permanent movement. The National Day of Respect, created in memory of the incident, was celebrated with concrete actions across the country. Companies closed their doors so employees could participate in volunteer work, schools promoted integration fairs, and communities organized collective lunches where people from different realities met. Richard, still by Edward's side, coordinated the international expansion of the project. "Yesterday we inaugurated the 10th Inclusion Center in Africa," he informed, "and the list of interested countries keeps growing." At the end of that afternoon, Edward participated in a video conference with global leaders. The program, developed in the United States, was being adapted to different cultural contexts, maintaining its essence of transformation through example. "Prejudice is a prison we build in our minds," he said during the conference, "but we also hold the key to liberation." The numbers confirmed the lasting impact of the initiative. Millions of people trained, public policies transformed, and a new generation growing up with more inclusive values. But it was the individual stories that moved Edward the most. Like that of the lady who, inspired by the campaign, transformed her small shop into a support center for vulnerable youth. Or the executive who abandoned his corporate career to create a professional training school in his community. At the end of the day, Edward met again with Charles, Mary, and Beatrice for coffee on the center's terrace. Observing the sunset over New York, they recalled how a moment of conflict had transformed into a movement of hope. "You know what makes me most proud?" Edward reflected. "It's not the international recognition or the awards. It's seeing how ordinary people have become agents of transformation in their own realities." Night fell over the city as they said their goodbyes. Edward remained a moment longer on the terrace, watching the lights come on. Each luminous point represented a story, a life, a possibility for change. The Beyond Appearances campaign had proved that when ordinary people decide to make a difference, the impossible becomes reality. And so, what began as a painful incident on an airplane had transformed into a global movement of social transformation, proving that the true value of a person lies far beyond appearances, residing in the infinite capacity of human beings to learn, change, and inspire others to do the same.